The world lay in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a vast, sleeping giant. Ice stretched farther than the eye could see, a boundless white sea under a sky that seemed endlessly gray. It was a silence broken only by the occasional groan of glaciers shifting, or the distant crash of ice cracking somewhere far beyond human hearing. Here, in this frozen expanse, life persisted. Not as we know it today, but stubborn, fragile, and determined to endure. These were people on the edge of survival, living at the margin of the known world. Their existence was measured in seasons of scarcity and abundance, marked by the slow passage of frost and thaw. They were hunters, gatherers, wanderers. Every step they took was a negotiation with the cold, every breath a defiance of the ice that pressed around them like an ancient, unyielding hand. Imagine for a moment the weight of such silence. It was not merely quiet. It was an absence of warmth, of certainty, of comfort. The air itself seemed to carry the cold like a living thing, seeping into bones, filling the lungs, whispering of the fragility of life. But it was within this silence that stories began. Stories passed from one generation to the next. Stories written not in words, but in footprints, stone tools, fire pits, and the shifting contours of frozen ground. This is the world into which they were born, a world carved by glaciers, sculpted by wind, and painted in shades of white and gray. Here, existence was not static, it was movement. Movement was survival. The need to move, to seek food, shelter, safety, drove their lives. Every choice was bound to the rhythms of the ice, to the slow pulse of seasons that could change without warning. They lived in a landscape of extremes. Summers were short and fleeting, with pale sunlight lingering over frozen plains. Winters were long, bitter, and unrelenting. Snow could arrive without notice, and storms could sweep across the land with such force that even the hardiest could not stand against them. Yet within these extremes was a strange beauty. The surface of the ice would glisten under the low sun, casting a light that seemed almost sacred. The air was so sharp and clear that breath itself seemed visible, a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and the cold beyond. And beneath that surface, life moved quietly. Herds of giant animals, mammoths, reindeer, and bison, traversed these frozen plains in search of sustenance, their migrations as ancient as the ice itself. These creatures were not merely food, they were lifelines. Their bones became tools, their hides clothing, their sinew rope. Every part of their being was woven into human survival. To follow them was to follow life itself. But something was shifting. The ice was changing. Cracks, invisible at first, began to grow. Deep fractures spread across the landscape, reshaping the ground beneath their feet. What had once seemed eternal was now breaking apart. For the people living here, it was not merely an environmental change, it was a shift that would reach into the very soul of their existence. The world they knew was fracturing, and with it, the stability of their lives. They had learned to read the signs, the patterns of wind, the shape of the clouds, the subtle changes in the ice. The elders spoke in quiet voices, passing their knowledge to those who would come after. They knew that survival required more than strength, it required understanding, courage, and a willingness to step into the unknown. And so, beneath the vast canopy of an indifferent sky, a decision was made. It was time to move. Not in haste, but with the careful precision of those who knew the value of each step. They gathered their belongings, whatever could be carried. Families huddled together, wrapped in skins, their breath curling in the air like smoke. The children looked on with a mixture of curiosity and fear, sensing that something profound was taking place. Their elders led the way, eyes fixed on horizons beyond sight. Movement itself became a story. Each footfall was a word, each crossing of an icy river a chapter. They were not simply walking across land, they were walking through history. The ice beneath them was more than frozen water, it was a living record of the Earth's memory. It bore the traces of countless journeys before them and would bear their own. This opening movement was not sudden, it was the result of a long and quiet build-up. The world had shifted imperceptibly over generations, and now those shifts had gathered into a moment of decisive change. It was the beginning of something vast, a journey that would stretch beyond maps, beyond memory, beyond even the boundaries of survival. Here, in the silence of the ice, a new story was beginning. The story of movement. Of transformation. Of the fragile, persistent will of life to continue against all odds. The ice, once eternal, was cracking. Beneath it, a people were on the move. And in that movement lay the heart of what it meant to be human. They stepped forward together, into the unknown. And as they did, the silence deepened, not as an ending, but as an opening. An opening into a story that would echo for thousands of years. Beneath the white silence of the ice, there were traces, subtle, hidden traces, left behind by those who had lived and moved before. Footprints pressed into frozen soil. Stones shaped by human hands. The faint, enduring echoes of life in a landscape that seemed endless and indifferent. These marks were not merely evidence of existence, they were the whispers of a story, waiting to be read. Archaeologists call them footprints in the frost, but to the people who left them, they were the records of survival. These traces tell us who they were. Not by name, for names do not survive tens of thousands of years, but by the evidence of their movement and skill. They were the hunters of a world ruled by ice, expert trackers who could read the language of snow and shadow. They were gatherers who knew the hidden places where life persisted even in the coldest seasons. They were craftsmen, shaping bone and stone into tools that would turn survival into possibility. The story of these people emerges slowly, layer by layer, like the uncovering of an ancient manuscript. Every artifact recovered, a spear point, a flake of flint, a fragment of carved bone, is a word in a silent language. Archaeologists interpret these fragments, reconstructing journeys that began long before written history. From these pieces emerges a picture of movement, of families and clans crossing vast distances, of communities bound together by survival and necessity. These migrations were not aimless. They followed the rhythms of the land, guided by instinct and necessity. Herds of reindeer and mammoth moved according to the shifting seasons, and people followed. The tracks of these animals formed a kind of living map, paths etched into the ice and snow that directed human movement. To follow these tracks was to follow life itself. It was a form of knowledge passed down through generations, a knowledge embedded in memory and shared through teaching. But how do we know this today? The evidence lies in the careful work of archaeologists and scientists. In frozen caves and riverbeds, tools have been preserved like time capsules. Ancient hearths hold traces of charcoal and bone, revealing what was eaten and how it was prepared. Footprints fossilized in mud show the patterns of movement across a landscape now lost to time. Every discovery is a fragment of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that tells us not only where they went, but who they were when they traveled. One of the most remarkable aspects of these traces is how they speak to the human experience. They tell us that migration is not merely a physical journey, but an emotional and cultural one. Moving across ice and tundra meant leaving behind familiar landscapes, leaving behind places of memory and safety. It meant entering uncertainty, trusting in the knowledge passed down by ancestors, and relying on the bonds of community. Movement was not survival alone, it was an act of hope. These movements left patterns that we can still trace today. In parts of Siberia, North America, and Europe, archaeologists have mapped ancient migration routes that stretch for thousands of miles. These routes speak of an interconnected world long before modern borders, a world where survival depended on understanding the land and the creatures that inhabited it. These pathways were not fixed, they shifted with the seasons, with the advance and retreat of glaciers, with the movement of herds. They were living routes, constantly reshaped by the world itself. The act of migration required knowledge of weather, of terrain, of animal behavior. It required the ability to read signs invisible to most of us today, the subtle shift in wind direction, the sound of cracking ice, the faint trace of an animal's trail. Elders taught the young to see and to interpret these signs. They taught them how to move as part of the landscape rather than apart from it, how to travel not only for survival but with an understanding of their place in the world. This was not a world of maps and GPS coordinates. It was a world of memory and instinct. Every migration was both a physical journey and a mental one, a journey written into the body, the memory, the culture of a people. Each crossing of ice and tundra became part of their collective story, a story that was told again and again by firesides and in the hush of long winter nights. These stories survive in fragments, in the artifacts buried deep beneath the ice, in the landscape itself, in the patterns of human movement that still echo across the continents. They speak of resilience, of adaptation, of a willingness to journey into the unknown. They remind us that movement is a defining feature of humanity. That migration is not merely a response to change, but a force that shapes who we are. The traces in the frost are not just evidence of ancient journeys. They are evidence of a deep truth, that humans have always been on the move. That movement is not an accident of history, but part of the human condition. From the first footsteps etched in frozen soil to the migrations of entire communities across continents, movement has been the thread that binds human history together. And so, when we look at these traces, we do not simply see footprints in the frost. We see the beginning of a story of endurance, of connection, of life pressing forward in the face of uncertainty. They are the first lines of a larger narrative, one that will unfold through the course of this journey. They remind us that the past is not distant or dead. It is present beneath our feet, in the ice and stone, in the memory of movement itself. In following these footprints, we follow a people not only across space, but through time. We follow them across millennia, through landscapes that no longer exist, into moments that shape the future of humanity. They lead us to ask a question that lies at the heart of our story: why do we move? And as we begin this journey, that question becomes more than historical. It becomes personal. Because somewhere in the silence of the frost, beneath the endless white, lies an answer. And that answer begins with a single step, a step taken by those who came before, into a world that was breaking, into a story that is still being written. The world of these people was shaped by forces far greater than themselves. Mountains rose and fell over epochs, rivers carved deep valleys, and the slow, relentless movement of glaciers sculpted the land into something both beautiful and terrifying. This was the age of ice, the last glacial period, when the earth was draped in sheets of frozen water that covered much of the northern hemisphere. It was a world of extremes, where survival depended on reading the language of the land and weather, and adapting to conditions that could change without warning. The ice was not simply a backdrop to human life, it was a force that defined existence. It shaped migration, dictated where life could flourish, and where it could not. Glaciers were not static, they moved with a slow but irresistible power, grinding rock beneath them, reshaping valleys, and creating barriers and bridges. These ice sheets acted as both highways and obstacles, opening routes across otherwise impassable landscapes, and closing others behind walls of frozen stone. To understand this world, we must imagine the scale of it. Entire continents were transformed. What we know today as coastlines, plains, and valleys were buried under thick ice, sometimes more than a kilometer deep. Sea levels were far lower than they are now, exposing land bridges such as the one between Siberia and Alaska, pathways that connected continents and allowed humans and animals to migrate across them. These land bridges were not permanent. They appeared and disappeared with the advance and retreat of the ice, making migration a matter of timing, knowledge, and risk. The shifting ice also reshaped the climate. Vast cold deserts spread across the earth, and the air became sharper, drier, and more biting. Storms could sweep across the plains with little warning, carrying with them drifts of snow and a cold so deep it seemed to pierce the soul. Yet within these extremes existed zones of life, places where animals gathered, where plants survived, and where humans could hunt and gather. Knowledge of these zones was essential. Those who moved with understanding thrived, those who did not risked vanishing without a trace. This was a world defined by contrast. Vast, empty expanses of ice could lie next to rich, fertile refuges where life clung on. Glacial rivers, swollen with meltwater, flowed with fierce power, carving channels that would persist long after the ice had gone. Mountains rose above the plains, their peaks sharp against the sky, their slopes shelters for both animals and humans. These contrasts shaped movement, creating corridors and barriers that guided migration in patterns we can still trace today. For the people of this time, the ice was both a challenge and a teacher. It taught them patience, the necessity of preparation, and the limits of human power. They learned to observe its subtle shifts, the way the wind shaped snowdrifts, how cracks appeared in the ice, how the surface of a glacier could change overnight. To move through this world was to be attuned to its rhythms. Migration was not a simple act of walking from one place to another, it was a dialogue with the environment. Every step was informed by an understanding of ice, weather, and terrain that was passed down through generations. This knowledge was not recorded in books, but in memory. It lived in the elders who guided the groups, in the songs and stories told around fires, in the rituals that marked departure and arrival. The landscape itself became a living map, its features etched into the collective mind. To cross it required both physical endurance and a deep connection to memory and tradition. The ice was a teacher, and those who listened could read its lessons in survival. But the ice was not constant. It moved and changed with time. Glaciers advanced and retreated, sometimes slowly over centuries, sometimes with sudden force. These changes created both danger and opportunity. An advancing glacier could bury a hunting ground, forcing a group to move. A retreating ice sheet could open new lands, rich with resources but unknown in their dangers. These shifts were part of a cycle that shaped not only the landscape but human life itself. We can see the traces of these cycles in the archaeological record. Layers of sediment tell of floods, ice advances, and retreats. Stone tools buried in ancient riverbeds speak of people who followed waters that no longer exist. Fossilized footprints in mud and snow reveal paths across terrain now transformed. These traces are fragments of a vast story of movement written in ice and stone. The ice was not merely an obstacle to be overcome, it was a defining force in human history. It shaped migrations, forged cultures, and influenced the very course of evolution. The need to adapt to glacial conditions drove innovation, in clothing, shelter, tools, and social organization. Survival depended on cooperation, knowledge, and the ability to plan for the long journey ahead. In this way, the ice shaped not only the land but the nature of human life itself. It is worth pausing to imagine what it might have been like to stand at the edge of a glacier, to look across an expanse of white stretching into the horizon. For those people, it was a world of awe and fear. The ice was a presence, vast, ancient, indifferent. To move through it was to accept both risk and possibility. It demanded courage, for beyond the ice lay uncertainty. Yet it also offered opportunity. Migration was a chance to discover new lands, to follow herds, to find life in places others had not yet reached. And so movement became inevitable. For all its danger, the ice was not the end. It was a threshold. To cross it was to step into a different world, a world transformed by shifting glaciers, by new climates, by the endless passage of time. These crossings were not random, they were part of a larger pattern, shaped by the deep rhythms of the earth. They were journeys that connected people across continents, that shaped the history of humanity. The Great Ice Divide was not a single line on a map. It was a living boundary, shifting and changing with the flow of glaciers. It was both barrier and pathway, danger and opportunity. To understand it is to understand the deep connection between climate, landscape, and movement. It is to understand that migration is not only a physical act but a dialogue with the world itself. For those who lived in this time, crossing the Great Ice Divide was more than survival. It was a transformation. It was stepping beyond the known into a new reality, and with each crossing, they rewrote the story of what it meant to be human. In this way, the ice was not only a force of nature, it was a force of history. The Great Ice Divide was not conquered. It was listened to, respected, and navigated. It shaped the paths of migration, the knowledge of survival, and the story of humanity itself. And in its shifting form, it left traces, footprints, tools, stories, that continue to speak to us today. Fire was life. For the people of the Ice Age, it was not merely warmth, but a force that shaped existence. It was a glowing center in a world of shadow, a fragile line between survival and death. In a landscape carved by frost, where temperatures could plunge far below freezing and storms could strip the land bare, fire was the heartbeat of human life. It was warmth in the cold, safety in the dark, and comfort in a world defined by uncertainty. The mastery of fire was not a single invention, but a skill honed over generations. It was learned through observation, trial, and countless seasons of survival. They learned where to find it, in natural wildfires sparked by lightning, in the glowing embers left by earlier fires, and how to carry it across frozen plains. Fire was kept alive through shared knowledge, handed down by elders to the young. Its preservation was a sacred task, for to lose the fire was to lose life itself. Imagine the first moment a spark was struck, the fragile glow flaring against the darkness. It was a moment of transformation. Fire turned frozen nights into spaces of warmth and safety. It drove away predators, extended the hours of activity, and allowed families to gather close. Around these flickering lights, humans shared stories, taught skills, passed on the wisdom of survival. Fire became a center of culture, a place of belonging amid a hostile world. Beyond warmth, fire was a tool of survival. It allowed the cooking of food, making it easier to digest and more nourishing in the lean months of winter. It provided light to hunt at dawn and dusk, to see footprints in the snow, to read the subtle changes in the land. It was a source of protection, its smoke driving away insects and its flames warding off predators. To carry fire across the tundra was to carry life. In the cold silence of the ice, fire was a language. It spoke of human ingenuity and determination. It was a quiet testament to the fact that survival was not only about strength, but about understanding. They learned how to use it to transform their world, how to warm stone for toolmaking, how to harden bone, how to cook meat and marrow for sustenance. Fire became intertwined with knowledge, and knowledge became the currency of survival. The importance of fire went beyond the practical. It shaped human culture and identity. Gathered around the flames, communities told stories that bound them together. These fires became the first theaters of human imagination, where myths were born and memory was kept alive. The crackle of embers became a companion to memory, a reminder of home and kinship. In the darkest winters, fire was a promise, the promise that life could endure. Yet fire was fragile. It demanded constant attention. A sudden wind could snuff out a flame. Snow and ice could extinguish it in an instant. Carrying fire from place to place was a skill that required preparation, discipline, and unity. It was a shared responsibility. In migrating communities, fire was carried forward like a sacred trust, passed from one person to another as the group moved through frozen landscapes. The movement of people across ice and tundra was often shaped by fire. Campsites were chosen not only for their proximity to resources but for their ability to maintain warmth and shelter. Fires were built in ways that reflected an intimate knowledge of place, using stones to shield from wind, choosing wood that burned steadily, protecting embers for the journeys ahead. Fire was a constant companion on the move, a living thread connecting past camps to future ones. Fire was also a teacher of patience. To sustain it, to coax life from sparks and embers, required skill and care. It taught the value of preparation, of forethought. In the world of the ice, those who mastered fire mastered survival. They understood that life was not simply about responding to the cold, but about shaping the conditions in which survival became possible. Fire was a tool of control, a way to claim warmth and life in a world otherwise ruled by ice. But fire was more than a tool. It was a symbol. It symbolized the human will to endure, to create, to transform the world. In the face of the cold vastness, fire was a defiance, a claim that life, no matter how fragile, would persist. It was a light in the darkness, a beacon guiding the people forward. To carry fire was to carry hope. As night fell across the tundra, and the wind moaned over frozen plains, the glow of fires became the heart of movement. They gathered in the stillness of camp, the flames reflecting in eyes that watched the shadows dance. Stories were told. Plans were made. Knowledge was shared. And beneath the vast dome of sky, in the silence of the ice, fire became more than warmth. It became life, memory, and the spark that carried humanity forward. Fire was the quiet center of their world. It was the warmth against the cold, the light against the darkness, and the promise of survival against the silence of the ice. In the age of glaciers, it was not merely a necessity, it was a force that shaped existence, a guide through the unknown. It was the first step toward hope, the first step toward movement. And in that fragile glow, beneath the endless silence of ice and sky, they found the courage to move. Movement is a choice born of necessity. For the people of the Ice Age, it was rarely a simple decision. It was the product of countless forces: hunger, weather, instinct, and survival. The need to move was written into the rhythm of their lives, a rhythm dictated by the slow but relentless changes of the world around them. They moved because the land no longer offered enough, because seasons shifted, because herds moved, and because the ice itself forced change. Migration was not an act of escape, it was an act of endurance. The decision to move was a collective one. It began with observation. Elders would notice subtle changes, the thinning of ice in a certain direction, the early arrival of meltwater, the patterns of animal tracks. These signs were read not with instruments, but with memory and experience, passed down through generations. They spoke of a time when movement would be required, when staying would mean peril, when crossing into the unknown was the only option for survival. These movements were part instinct and part knowledge. They were guided by an intimate understanding of the land. They knew where the rivers ran, where the snow would be thin enough to cross, where shelter could be found. Migration was mapped in memory long before maps existed. The landscape itself became a living guide, marked in the minds of those who journeyed through it. Every mountain, every valley, every ridge of ice carried meaning. But movement was also driven by the deeper currents of human existence. It was not simply about survival in the present, but about securing a future. It was about finding food for children, shelter for families, and safety for communities. In a world of scarcity, staying still could mean slow starvation, exposure to the elements, or being trapped as the ice shifted. Movement became a form of strategy, a way to manage risk and seek opportunity. There was also an element of instinct. Migration was woven into human nature long before recorded history. It was part of the biological rhythm of our species. Our ancestors moved to follow herds, to follow the seasons, to follow life itself. This instinct was carried in their bodies, in the memory of generations who had learned that movement was survival. It was not only a response to change, it was an embrace of it. The landscape of the Ice Age demanded movement. The advance of glaciers could transform fertile hunting grounds into barren ice fields in decades. Rivers could freeze, redirecting paths of migration. Storms could blanket the land in snow within hours. Those who lived in this world learned that permanence was an illusion. To survive was to move, to adapt, to follow the subtle changes in the land and climate. Migration was not a single journey but a continuous process, an ongoing dialogue between people and their environment. This was not migration in the way we think of it today. It was not guided by borders or governments, but by the deep knowledge of the land and its creatures. Herds of reindeer and mammoth were not just prey, they were guides. Their migrations traced the most viable routes through the ice. To follow them was to follow life itself. These routes became traditions, paths repeated across generations. They became part of the culture of movement, a shared knowledge passed down with reverence. The act of moving was both practical and profound. It required preparation, gathering supplies, securing tools, selecting the right time. It required courage, for every step forward was a step into uncertainty. And it required trust, in the knowledge of elders, in the instinct of the group, in the promise that beyond the horizon there might be something better. Movement was not a solitary act, it was the collective effort of a community. Migration shaped identity. It was not simply a physical relocation, but a transformation of self. To move was to change, to leave behind what was familiar and step into what was unknown. This transformation was felt in the body, in the mind, and in the spirit. Communities carried with them their traditions, stories, and memories, but each journey reshaped them. Movement became part of who they were. The call to move was also a call to hope. It was the belief that somewhere ahead there was sustenance, safety, and life. In the Ice Age, hope was not abstract, it was a survival strategy. It was carried in every step across frozen ground, in every shared story, in every fire lit at the end of a day's journey. To move was to affirm life, even when the world around seemed relentless in its cold. And yet, movement was not without loss. Leaving meant saying farewell to places held dear, to landscapes remembered in detail. It meant abandoning campsites that had been home, leaving behind the marks of life etched into the land. There was grief in movement, a quiet mourning for what was left behind. But there was also courage, the courage to step forward despite fear, to embrace uncertainty, and to trust that the journey would lead somewhere worth reaching. Migration was an act of balance between risk and reward. It was weighed in the silence before dawn, when decisions were made around the warmth of a fire. Elders spoke softly of routes and signs. Families prepared. Tools were sharpened, skins repaired. Every departure was a ritual, an acknowledgement that life depended on movement. The call to move was also a philosophical one. It was a recognition that life was change. The people of the Ice Age understood, in their own way, that movement was not merely a reaction to environment, but a defining feature of existence. To move was to live. To move was to engage with the world in its constant flux. Migration was part of the human story, not just survival, but transformation. And so, beneath the vast silence of ice and sky, they began to move. They stepped forward not only out of necessity, but out of a deep, instinctive understanding that life itself was a journey. They carried with them more than tools and skins, they carried memory, hope, and the knowledge that movement was the path to survival. In this way, the call to move was never simply a decision. It was a truth written into the human condition. And in answering it, they began a story that would ripple through time. The earth beneath them was changing. It was a slow transformation, almost imperceptible at first, but then undeniable. Cracks began to appear in the great sheets of ice, thin lines at first, like veins of some living thing awakening. Then they widened, groaning and splitting with a sound that seemed to echo through the stillness of the frozen world. The ice was breaking. And with it came a turning point, a moment that would force a people to face the reality of movement in a way they had never faced before. This was no ordinary change. It was the fracture of a world. Ice that had seemed eternal was yielding to forces beyond human control. Beneath the feet of hunters and wanderers, the landscape itself shifted. What had once been solid ground became treacherous. Rivers swollen with meltwater carved new valleys. Hidden crevasses yawned open, swallowing the familiar and creating uncertainty where there had been certainty. The land was in motion, and so were they. To those who lived in this world, the breaking of ice was a sign, a warning and a challenge. They had learned to read the subtle language of the land, the texture of snow, the sound of shifting glaciers, the way the wind carried warmth or cold. The breaking of the ice was a language too, one that spoke of change, of danger, of an ending and a beginning. It was a summons to move, and they knew it. The breaking ice was both physical and symbolic. Physically, it reshaped the terrain, altering routes and destroying places that had been safe for generations. Entire hunting grounds were swallowed or rendered inaccessible. Campsites were abandoned. What had once been familiar became foreign. The fracture demanded adaptation. For a people who had already lived lives defined by movement, this was a new level of uncertainty, and an intensification of necessity. Symbolically, the breaking of the ice was a rupture in the human story. It was the moment when the ground beneath life itself seemed to fracture. It was a reminder of the fragility of existence, of the fact that nothing was permanent. For those who witnessed it, it must have felt like standing at the edge of the world, watching it change beneath their feet. There was awe in that moment, and fear. It was a turning point where survival became not just a matter of living, but of moving beyond what had been known. This fracture of the ice was part of a larger process. Climate was not static. For centuries, glaciers advanced and retreated, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes with sudden force. These changes created both danger and opportunity. An advancing ice sheet could obliterate a way of life. A retreating one could open new lands, rich with resources but unknown in their dangers. In the language of survival, the breaking of the ice was a call to action. It was a signal that the time for stillness was over. The breaking ice also changed the very relationship between humans and their environment. The landscape was no longer a fixed map, but a shifting world that demanded constant attention. Routes that had been safe for generations could vanish overnight. New paths could appear, but they were untested and dangerous. To move in such a world required courage, knowledge, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. It required a deep understanding that survival was tied to the ability to read change and respond to it. For the people of this time, the breaking ice was not an abstract concept. It was lived experience. They felt it beneath their feet, in the way the ground trembled, in the sound of cracking glaciers, in the sight of rivers swelling with meltwater. They knew that their world was shifting in ways they could not control. This knowledge became part of the decision to move. The fracture of the ice was not simply a natural event, it was a turning point in their journey. Movement in this context was both survival and transformation. To follow a new path meant abandoning what was known, stepping into uncertainty, and confronting risk. Yet it was also a moment of possibility. The breaking ice opened new landscapes, new opportunities for sustenance and shelter. It was a fracture that could lead to new beginnings. For those who chose to move, it was both a danger and an invitation, the invitation to step into a world remade by change. The breaking of ice would have been a shared memory, passed down through generations. It was not an event of a single moment, but a process, a slow change felt over years, marked by the rhythms of seasons and the cycles of life. Stories of cracking ice, of landscapes shifting beneath feet, would have been told around fires, becoming part of the cultural memory of a people on the move. These stories were not just about survival, but about identity, about understanding who they were. In a changing world. There was a rhythm to this change. The breaking ice was not sudden in the deep measure of time, but it carried suddenness in the measure of human life. It was a rupture that could happen within a generation, and yet it was the product of centuries. This paradox, of slow change and sudden rupture, shaped the experience of movement. It taught that survival depended on both patience and readiness, on understanding the long patterns of the world and responding to moments of crisis. The breaking ice was also a moment of tension. It was a pause in the movement of life, a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. It was a turning point where choices mattered. To stay could mean danger. To move could mean risk. The fracture was both a challenge and a call to courage. It was a test of will and wisdom, a moment that would decide not just survival, but the direction of the journey ahead. In this way, the breaking of ice became part of the story of movement. It was not merely an environmental event, but a pivotal moment in human history. It was a fracture that reshaped not only landscapes but lives. It was a turning point that transformed migration from a rhythm of life into a deliberate act of crossing into unknown worlds, crossing into a new reality shaped by climate, risk, and possibility. The breaking of ice was a threshold. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For those who lived in its shadow, it was not a moment of despair, but a summons to move, to adapt, to step beyond the boundaries of the known. Beneath the groaning, cracking surface of the ice lay a new path. And they would follow it. Because in the world of the Ice Age, when the ground itself shifted beneath your feet, there was only one choice: to move. They began to move with a quiet determination. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer a distant warning, it had become a reality they could not ignore. The world was shifting, and with it, everything they knew. Movement was no longer an option, it was an imperative. The journey ahead was uncertain, and yet it was a journey they had been preparing for, in knowledge and instinct, for generations. Their departure was not a single moment of action, but a process. It began before the first step was taken, in the careful gathering of tools, in the repairing of hides and clothing, in the preparation of food for the long road ahead. Every part of their lives was bound to the act of moving. Migration was not sudden, it was deliberate, woven into the rhythm of preparation. It was a decision made in seasons, in conversations around fires, in the reading of landscapes. The preparation itself was a story of survival. Elders passed instructions quietly to the young. They spoke of routes to take, of dangers to avoid, of places where food and shelter could be found. These lessons were not written but lived. They existed in the way tools were made, in the way clothing was sewn, in the way the group arranged itself for travel. Preparation was both practical and cultural, a ritual that bound them together and steeled them for what lay ahead. As they gathered to move, there was a sense of unity and resolve. Movement in the age of ice was not the act of a single person, but of a community. It required cooperation, trust, and shared purpose. Every step forward depended on the strength of the group, on the willingness of each member to carry what was needed, to keep the fire alive, to watch for signs of danger. Migration was not merely physical, it was a collective act of endurance and hope. Their departure was marked by a mixture of fear and anticipation. To leave meant abandoning what was familiar, campsites, hunting grounds, and places of memory. It meant stepping into uncertainty, carrying with them only what could be carried. There was grief in this leaving, a mourning for what was left behind. And yet there was also hope, hope that ahead lay safety, sustenance, and a future. Movement was a choice born of both loss and possibility. The path they took was shaped by the land itself. Routes were chosen not by maps, but by knowledge passed down through generations and learned through direct experience. They followed the signs of the animals they hunted, reading tracks in the snow, listening to the whispers of wind across the ice. Herds of reindeer and mammoth became guides, leading them across landscapes transformed by climate. To follow these paths was to follow life itself. The movement was slow, deliberate, and deeply aware. It was not simply a crossing of space, but a crossing of time. They carried with them not only tools and provisions, but memory and tradition. Every step became part of a larger journey, a journey that was physical, cultural, and spiritual. Migration was a living story, told in footprints pressed into snow, in fires lit at the end of a day, in the songs and stories shared under the stars. The journey was not without danger. The landscape was treacherous. Hidden crevasses yawned under snowfields. Rivers swollen with meltwater had to be crossed. Storms could arrive without warning, sweeping the land in white and darkness. To move in such a world required vigilance, skill, and courage. Every step forward was a test of endurance and trust. They moved not simply to survive, but to confront uncertainty with unity and purpose. The act of movement became a ritual. Before setting out, they gathered around fires, sharing food and knowledge. Elders spoke of the journey ahead, of the signs to watch for, of the dangers that might lie in wait. These conversations were part of the preparation, binding the group together in shared understanding. Migration was not simply a physical act, it was a cultural act, shaped by knowledge, memory, and the collective will to endure. Each step carried meaning. To move was to engage with the world, to accept change, and to embrace the unknown. Movement was not just survival, it was transformation. The act of crossing ice and tundra became an assertion of life against the silence of the world. It was a way of shaping the future, of carrying memory into new places. In every step was a story, written into the landscape and carried in the hearts of those who walked. They moved in patterns shaped by instinct and tradition. The elders guided them, drawing on the knowledge of generations. Routes were chosen for reasons both practical and cultural, following herds, seeking shelter, avoiding dangers. Movement was a living dialogue with the land, a conversation written in footprints and echoes. It was a shared path, one that connected past and future, life and survival. The migration was both physical and philosophical. It was a crossing not only of space, but of thresholds. To move was to step beyond what was known into a realm of uncertainty. It was an acceptance that life was change, and that survival depended on the willingness to embrace it. Migration became a form of resilience, a proof of humanity's capacity to endure. There was a rhythm to this movement. Days were measured in steps, nights in rest beside fire. Seasons were measured in the shifting of the ice and the movement of herds. Migration became part of a larger cycle, the cycle of life in a changing world. Every crossing was a chapter in a story of endurance written in snow, stone, and memory. As they moved, they carried with them more than provisions and tools. They carried their culture, their traditions, their stories. They carried the knowledge of the land, passed down through generations. They carried the memory of those who had moved before them. Migration was not simply about reaching a destination, it was about carrying life forward, into places not yet known. The path ahead was uncertain, but they moved with a quiet determination. They stepped forward with the knowledge that movement was both a necessity and a choice. It was a decision to embrace change, to trust in memory and knowledge, and to journey into the unknown. In that step lay the essence of survival. For the people of the Ice Age, movement was not merely a passage. It was life itself. To move was to live. And in the silence of the ice, with the fracture beneath their feet and the horizon ahead, they moved forward together. The land they entered was transformed. Where once ice had ruled, now there were rivers and plains newly revealed. The breaking of the glacier had opened a world that was unfamiliar and alive with possibility. Meltwater carved deep channels through the landscape, and valleys that had lain hidden for centuries were exposed to light for the first time. It was a land in transition, both dangerous and full of promise. To the people who arrived there, this new land was both a challenge and an opportunity. It offered the chance of rich hunting grounds, fresh water, and shelter. But it also demanded a new kind of knowledge. The routes they had known no longer applied. The land was unfamiliar, and every step required caution and attention. Movement into this new world was not simply physical, it was an act of exploration. Exploration in this age was an embodied knowledge. There were no maps or compasses. Guidance came from experience, memory, and instinct. Elders would observe the land, read the patterns of wind and water, study the behavior of animals. The youngest among them learned by watching, absorbing the subtle signs that pointed the way forward. Every crossing became a lesson, every step a part of living knowledge passed down through generations. The landscape itself told a story. Rocks revealed the history of shifting ice. Riverbeds spoke of centuries of meltwater carving valleys. The shapes of hills and ridges carried the memory of glaciers that had once pressed down with unimaginable weight. To move through such a land was to move through the memory of the earth itself. Each step became a connection with the deep past. For these people, movement was never purely practical. It was also cultural and spiritual. Crossing into a new land was entering into a dialogue with the unknown. It was a test of courage and a reaffirmation of identity. They carried their traditions and stories with them, bringing them into this newly revealed world. Migration was an act of carrying life, physical, cultural, and spiritual, into the future. The journey into this transformed land was shaped by both risk and opportunity. Rivers swollen with meltwater could not always be crossed safely. Snowfields and ice patches hid treacherous crevasses. Storms could arise without warning, blanketing the land in white. Yet the land also offered game and shelter, places where water ran and plants grew. These dangers and promises defined the rhythm of movement. To journey here required not only skill but a willingness to embrace uncertainty. They moved in patterns shaped by both instinct and strategy. Herds of animals became guides, their migrations pointing the way. The people followed, reading the land as if it were a living map. Every sign, the tracks of a reindeer, the pattern of snowdrifts, the sound of running water, became part of their navigation. Movement was not random. It was guided by a deep understanding of the cycles of life and the land. This new land demanded adaptation. Tools had to be repaired or replaced. Clothing had to be adapted for changing conditions. Campsites had to be chosen with care. Every choice carried consequences. Survival depended on the ability to adapt quickly to the shifting world. Migration was not simply about moving from one place to another, it was about learning to live in a constantly changing environment. The crossing into this land was a transformation. It was a crossing not only of geography but of time and being. To step into this place was to leave behind one world and enter another. It was a moment of change, where the old patterns of life were tested and new ones were forged. This transformation was part of what it meant to move. Migration was not just a journey, it was a process of becoming. This process was shaped by memory. The people carried with them knowledge of past journeys, of places where they had found safety and sustenance. This memory was a compass, guiding them through the unknown. But memory was not fixed. It was tested and reshaped by the experience of crossing into new lands. Movement was a living process, shaped by both past knowledge and present reality. In this new land, every step carried meaning. It was a step into survival, into transformation, into the possibility of something new. To move was to claim life against the silence of the world. Migration became a story written in footsteps, in campsites, in fires lit at night. It was a story told by movement itself. There was a rhythm to this migration. Days were measured in distance, nights in rest beside fire. Camps were chosen for shelter and warmth, for proximity to water and game. Movement was punctuated by pauses, moments of rest, of gathering, of preparing for the steps ahead. These pauses were as important as the movement itself, moments when the journey became part of life rather than merely a means to survival. The land they entered was still in motion. Meltwater continued to carve new channels. Ice still shifted and cracked. Storms still swept the plains. Movement was not a single crossing, but a process of continual adjustment. They moved not only through space but through a landscape that was alive with change. Migration was a conversation with the land, a relationship that required attention, respect, and adaptation. In crossing into this new world, they were not merely surviving, they were becoming. They were carrying life forward, bringing memory and knowledge into a transformed landscape. Migration was not simply an act of leaving one place and reaching another. It was a journey of transformation, a passage that shaped both land and people. And so they moved forward, into the unknown. They stepped into a world remade by the fracture of ice, carrying with them the knowledge of who they were and the hope of what they could become. In every step, they carried the story of movement itself, a story written in footprints, in firelight, in the silence of the ice. The crossing was not without cost. Every journey left marks, in the body, in the mind, and in the land itself. Travel through this fractured, changing world demanded strength and endurance. Muscles ached under the weight of burdens carried across miles of snow and stone. Feet grew sore, skins chafed, and frostbitten fingers testified to the price of movement. Yet even these costs were weighed against a deeper necessity, survival. To remain still was to risk being trapped in a world that was shifting beneath them. Movement was both hardship and hope. The dangers of crossing were constant companions. Crevasses hidden beneath snow could open without warning. Glacial rivers could sweep away the unwary. Storms could appear with sudden force, reducing the world to a white blur of wind and snow. They moved with awareness of these dangers, learning to read the language of the land. The sound of cracking ice, the smell of meltwater, the change in wind, each became part of the knowledge that guided their path. Movement was never blind. It was a careful act of listening and responding. Their path was not straight. It curved around obstacles, traced the edges of glaciers, crossed valleys newly revealed by retreating ice. Every detour was part of a larger journey, every hesitation a negotiation with the land. Movement was shaped not only by distance, but by the constant negotiation of risk. To travel was to navigate not just physical terrain, but the uncertainty of the world itself. The crossing was also a test of endurance for the group as a whole. Migration in this age was not an individual act, but a collective one. Every member played a role. Elders guided, hunters scouted, children followed, carrying with them the traditions and knowledge of the people. The group moved as a unit, bound by necessity and trust. This unity was essential. Alone, survival in such a world was near impossible. Together, there was a greater chance to endure the fracture beneath their feet. They moved not only with their bodies, but with their minds and spirits. Migration was a journey of adaptation, but also of transformation. It reshaped how they saw themselves and their place in the world. The crossing became part of their identity, a defining experience that would be carried forward in memory. Stories of this migration would be told around fires for generations, becoming part of the culture that bound them together. Movement was not just physical, it was a thread in the fabric of their history. Every step across the fractured ice was an act of courage. To move meant accepting uncertainty, relinquishing the familiar, and stepping into a world not yet known. This courage was born of necessity, but it was also born of hope, the hope that ahead lay safety, sustenance, and life. In the cold silence of the ice, courage became a quiet force, carried in the determination of each step, in the resolve of the group, and in the stories told beside the fire each night. The crossing was shaped by a rhythm. There were days of steady travel, marked by a silent focus on the path ahead. There were days of rest, when the group gathered together, tending fires, repairing clothing, and preparing for the next step. Movement was not a single push forward, but a cycle of motion and pause. These pauses were moments of renewal, physical, emotional, and cultural. They were times to rest, to reflect, to reaffirm the shared purpose of the journey. This rhythm of movement was part of a larger cycle of survival in the age of ice. Migration was not a single journey, but part of a long pattern of crossing and settlement. The fracture of the ice was one moment in this ongoing cycle. What followed was not simply arrival, but the continuation of movement, the choice to adapt, to settle temporarily, and then to move again when the land demanded it. Migration was a way of life, written into the very structure of existence. The crossing was also a moment of transformation. To step from one world into another was to alter the relationship between people and land. They carried with them knowledge of where they had been and hopes for where they would go. The crossing became part of the story of who they were, shaping their identity and their future. Movement was not merely relocation, it was an act of becoming. They crossed with awareness that the land itself was part of the journey. Every footstep pressed into snow became a mark in the memory of the earth. Every fire lit at night was a signal of life in the silence of the ice. Every shared story was a way of carrying experience forward. Migration was not simply about reaching a destination, it was about creating meaning in the act of crossing. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between the movement, there were pauses, moments when the wind stilled, when the group halted to observe the land. In these moments, they listened, to the sound of cracking ice, to the movement of water, to the patterns of the sky. These silences were part of the language of movement, moments when survival became not only a physical act, but a deep engagement with the world around them. In crossing this fractured land, they were not simply surviving, they were making history. Every step was a testimony to endurance. Every crossing was a story that would live on. The fracture of the ice was not an end, but a beginning, a moment when movement became both a necessity and an act of transformation. In the silence that followed each day's journey, the crossing became part of the deeper story of life in the age of ice. The crossing was a choice. It was a choice to embrace change, to face danger, to carry hope into the unknown. It was a choice that defined their lives and shaped the path of humanity. In that choice was the essence of migration, not simply moving across the land, but moving forward in the story of life itself. And so they crossed. Step by step, hour by hour, driven by necessity and courage. They crossed with memory in their minds, fire in their hearts, and the knowledge that movement was life. In crossing, they became part of the eternal rhythm of the earth, a rhythm of change, endurance, and hope. The land ahead was not simply terrain to be crossed, it was a story waiting to be read. Every ridge, every valley, every stretch of cracked ice held meaning. To move through this world was to move through a living history written in stone and snow. The fracture beneath their feet had not only shaped the physical landscape but had carved a deeper passage into memory. For these people, migration was not merely a journey. It was a living dialogue between the present and the past. They moved with awareness that the land was part of their story. Every step became an act of interpretation. They read the tracks of animals, the shape of snowdrifts, the sound of shifting ice. These signs were more than guides for movement, they were part of a shared language, a way of understanding the world. Migration was not a blind crossing but an intentional engagement with the living memory of the land. The fracture beneath them had changed not only the routes but the meaning of movement itself. It was no longer a cycle of survival alone. It had become a crossing of thresholds, a passage from one world into another. The ice, once seemingly eternal, was breaking, and with it came both danger and possibility. Movement was a claim on life in a world defined by change. It was both a necessity and a statement. To move was to affirm existence. The crossing shaped the culture of those who moved. It was recorded not in written words, but in stories told beside fires. These were stories of endurance, of courage, of following paths laid down by generations before. They were stories of leaving and arriving, of losing and finding, of adapting to a world that would not stand still. Migration became part of identity, a living tradition passed from elders to youth. The crossing was part of the memory carried forward. The movement was also an act of transformation. It reshaped relationships within the group. To travel together through uncertain land required trust, cooperation, and shared purpose. Every individual depended on others, for guidance, for protection, for warmth. Movement was not merely physical, it was a forging of unity. In crossing together, they became more than a group of travelers, they became a community defined by shared experience. Crossing the fractured ice was an encounter with uncertainty. They could not know what lay ahead. Every step could bring danger, but it could also bring opportunity. This uncertainty shaped their movement. It made them attentive, adaptable, and cautious. The crossing demanded a rhythm, a balance between speed and caution, between forward motion and careful observation. Migration became an act of continual adjustment. The rhythm of crossing was shaped by the landscape itself. Days were measured by distance and weather. Nights were measured by the warmth of fire and the sharing of stories. Movement was punctuated by pauses, moments of rest, of preparation, of reflection. These pauses were as much part of the journey as the steps themselves. They were moments when migration became not only an act of survival but an act of understanding. The crossing was a lesson in resilience. It tested strength of body and spirit. It demanded adaptation, endurance, and the capacity to carry hope forward. Every hardship faced became part of the story they carried. The fracture of the ice was both trial and teacher. It taught them that survival was not simply about reaching a destination, but about learning to move with the changing world. The crossing also carried a deeper meaning. It was a passage not just through land, but through time. To move was to enter into a larger history, the history of human movement, of adaptation, of survival. Every step was part of this continuum. Migration was not an isolated act but part of the story of life itself. In crossing, they participated in something far greater than themselves. There was a silent truth in this crossing: movement was life. To stand still was to surrender to the fracture beneath the feet. To move was to affirm existence. This was a truth known without words. It was carried in muscle and breath, in firelight and story, in the shared purpose of a people on the move. Migration became an act of affirmation, a living proof of resilience against the silence of the ice. The crossing was also a transformation of perspective. As they moved, the world revealed itself in new ways. The fracture beneath them was no longer a single event, but part of a broader story of change. They began to see movement itself as a way of knowing, a way of understanding not just the land, but their place within it. Migration became a way of reading the world. They moved with the sense that they were part of a larger rhythm. The fracture of the ice was one moment in the ongoing cycle of the earth. Movement was part of that cycle. Every crossing was a chapter in a story written in footprints, in fires, in the silence between storms. Migration was a way of carrying life forward, of shaping the future through each step taken into the unknown. And so they moved, step by step, crossing the fractured world before them. Each movement was both an ending and a beginning. It was an answer to the fracture beneath their feet, and a promise of what lay beyond. In their crossing, they carried not only themselves, but the story of movement itself, a story of endurance, adaptation, and hope. In the silence of the ice, they moved forward together, carrying memory, knowledge, and the living truth that movement was the essence of survival. The journey had become more than a crossing. It had become a transformation of being. Every day brought new challenges, but also a growing sense that movement was a kind of living knowledge. They were learning not only to read the land, but to read themselves, their fears, their strengths, their place in the unfolding story of life. Migration had become a meditation, a rhythm of survival and discovery. They moved through landscapes shaped by ancient forces. Hills carved by glaciers, rivers formed by melting ice, valleys open to the sky, each feature was a reminder that the world itself was alive in movement. To travel here was to become part of a larger rhythm. They carried with them not only their own bodies and tools, but the memory of every crossing that had come before. Migration was a living tradition, a way of carrying the past into the future. This transformation was not only physical, but also cultural. The act of movement reshaped how they related to one another. Crossing together required trust, cooperation, and shared purpose. The group became a community bound by movement. Elders guided, hunters scouted, and children followed, learning the language of the journey. Migration was not merely travel, it was the making of a people. The fracture beneath their feet had altered the very meaning of home. Home was no longer a fixed place, but something carried within. To move was to carry home forward. They carried the memory of fires lit beside stone shelters, of songs sung under the sky, of the touch of familiar hands. Migration was a carrying of life itself, a living bridge between what was left behind and what lay ahead. The land they moved through was both a challenge and a teacher. It demanded attention, adaptation, and courage. Crevasses and meltwater channels became tests of skill. Storms taught endurance. The shifting ice taught the necessity of change. To move was to enter into a conversation with the land, to learn from it, to listen, to adapt. Movement became not merely an act of survival, but a way of knowing. They moved with a deep awareness of fragility. Every step could bring danger. Every night could bring storm. The world was unpredictable. Yet this fragility was matched by a quiet strength, the strength to keep moving in the face of uncertainty. Migration was both a necessity and a declaration of resilience. It was a living answer to the fracture beneath their feet. The journey became a cycle of motion and pause. Days were measured in distance and effort. Nights were measured in warmth and reflection. Campsites became places of renewal, where fires were lit and stories shared. These pauses were as important as movement itself. They were moments when the group became aware of the deeper meaning of the crossing. Movement was not simply a passage, it was a living ritual. The crossing shaped identity. To move was to transform. Every step forward reshaped the relationship between people and land, between self and community. Migration was not a single act, but an ongoing process of becoming. They were not merely travelers, they were part of a living story, one written in footprints across ice, in fires lit under the stars, in the silent rhythms of movement. There was a deeper truth in the crossing: movement was a kind of knowing. It was an embodied knowledge, learned through the senses and memory. They read the land with their feet, their eyes, their ears. They learned to listen to the silence, to watch for signs, to feel the rhythm of the earth. Migration became a way of understanding the world, a way of carrying knowledge forward. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer simply a danger. It had become a teacher. It had taught that permanence was an illusion. It had taught that survival depended on adaptability. It had taught that life itself was movement. The crossing became a living embodiment of this lesson. Movement was not a detour from life, it was life itself. This awareness shaped their movement. They moved not only with urgency, but with attention and reverence. Every crossing was a negotiation with the land. Every step became part of a dialogue between past and future. Migration was not simply a physical act, but a conscious participation in the ongoing story of life. It was a living bridge between what had been and what was yet to come. The crossing was also a moment of memory. They carried with them the knowledge of past journeys, of paths followed by ancestors, of seasons survived, of hardships endured. This memory was not static. It was shaped and reshaped by the crossing itself. Movement became a way of carrying history forward, of weaving the past into the present. Migration was a story told in footsteps and firelight. The crossing demanded a balance between endurance and hope. Endurance was necessary to survive the dangers of the land. Hope was necessary to sustain movement into the unknown. This balance was the heart of migration. It was carried in every step, in every decision to move forward despite uncertainty. The fracture beneath their feet was both a challenge and a summons, a call to endurance, and a call to hope. They moved with a sense of purpose beyond survival. Movement was not simply about finding food or shelter. It was about carrying life forward. It was about creating meaning in the act of crossing. Migration became a living testament to resilience, to courage, and to the enduring capacity of life to adapt. Every step was part of that living story. The crossing was a threshold. It marked a passage from one world into another. It was a moment when the old patterns of life gave way to new ones. It was a moment when movement itself became a form of transformation. Migration was no longer simply a necessity, it was an act of becoming. They crossed with the knowledge that movement was both survival and creation. And so they moved forward. Step by step, they carried life into the unknown. They carried memory, knowledge, and the quiet truth that movement was the essence of survival. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. In their crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footprints, in firelight, and in the silent rhythm of movement. In the stillness between steps, they carried the knowledge that to move was to live. The land they entered was quieter now, though still alive with movement. The fracture beneath their feet had settled into a new rhythm. Meltwater flowed in steady channels, wind shaped the ridges, and snowfields shifted beneath the cold sky. This was a world remade, both familiar and foreign. To move here was to step into a living landscape, one that was still speaking, still teaching, still shaping those who crossed it. They moved with the awareness that this was not merely a passage of distance, but a passage of meaning. Every step was part of a living journey that connected them to what had come before and what lay ahead. Movement was no longer only survival, it had become a meditation on existence. They carried the stories of past crossings with them, stories told beside firelight, stories of endurance, loss, and transformation. Migration had become a form of memory. The crossing was changing them. It reshaped the body, hardening muscles, refining senses, sharpening awareness. But it also reshaped the mind. Movement demanded constant attention, to the signs in the land, to the shifting weather, to the needs of the group. They moved with a kind of quiet mindfulness, a deep engagement with the world around them. Migration was not a blind rush forward. It was a careful and deliberate passage. They moved in a rhythm set by both the land and their own needs. Days were filled with steady steps and careful observation. Nights were filled with rest, tending fires, repairing tools, and sharing stories. This rhythm was part of the art of movement. It was a balance between endurance and renewal, between forward motion and pause. Migration was a cycle, a living dance between action and reflection. The land they crossed shaped the way they moved. There were stretches of open tundra, where movement was swift and unbroken. There were fields of fractured ice, where every step required caution. There were narrow valleys carved by meltwater, where the path was forced and slow. Movement became a negotiation with the landscape, a dialogue between human will and the living world. The fracture beneath their feet had changed not only the land, but the meaning of home. Home was no longer a fixed place. It was something carried with them, in their tools, their fires, their stories, and their memory. Migration became the living embodiment of home as a journey. They carried home forward, step by step, across the fractured world. There was a quiet transformation in this carrying. To move became an act of carrying more than provisions and tools. They carried knowledge, tradition, memory, and identity. They carried the voices of those who had walked before them. Migration became a living bridge between past and future, a way of carrying life forward into an uncertain world. The crossing demanded courage. Every step into the unknown required leaving certainty behind. To move was to embrace risk. It was to accept that the world could change without warning. Yet there was also a quiet joy in this crossing, the joy of stepping into something new, of carrying life forward, of being part of the living story of movement. Migration was not simply survival. It was the art of becoming. They moved with a deep sense of purpose. The fracture beneath their feet had become a call, a summons to carry life forward. Every crossing was a choice to keep moving, to embrace change, to transform. Movement became a living statement, that life endures, that memory carries forward, that hope can be walked into existence. The land offered both danger and gift. Meltwater channels could sweep away a crossing. Ice could crack without warning. Storms could arrive suddenly. Yet there were places where game gathered, where fresh water flowed, where shelter could be found. To move was to navigate between risk and reward. Migration became a living negotiation with the world, a balance between caution and courage. This negotiation was part of the deeper meaning of movement. It was not simply about reaching a destination. It was about the crossing itself, the living act of becoming. Every step was both survival and transformation. Migration was a passage through the fracture of the ice and into the living memory of the land. The crossing was a moment of silence as much as motion. Between the steps there were pauses, moments to listen, to watch, to feel. In these silences they learned. They listened to the sound of cracking ice, to the rush of water, to the movement of wind. They watched the land for signs. They felt the weight of their journey in muscle and breath. Migration became a conversation with the world, a living act of listening. They moved with the sense that they were part of something greater. Migration was not a solitary act. It was part of a larger rhythm of life, a cycle of movement that connected generations. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story of crossing. Every step was a continuation of this story, every crossing a renewal of life. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing demanded endurance. It tested the body and the spirit. It demanded adaptation, attention, and trust. Yet it also carried hope, the hope that beyond the fracture lay safety, sustenance, and a future. Migration became an act of both survival and faith. It was a living proof that life endures in movement. The crossing was also a transformation of perspective. They began to see movement not just as a necessity, but as a way of knowing. To cross was to learn. Every step was part of a living lesson in the language of the land, in the rhythms of survival, in the art of endurance. Migration became a kind of wisdom, a living knowledge written in footprints. And so they moved. Step by step, crossing into the world beyond the fracture. They carried memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was the essence of life. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end. It was a passage. And in crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in firelight, in footsteps, and in the silence of the land. In every step was the affirmation that to move was to live. The land ahead was both promise and uncertainty. The fracture beneath their feet had opened into something vast, a world at once new and ancient. Ice and stone gave way to valleys carved by water, to ridges softened by wind. Rivers ran with cold clarity, and distant horizons shimmered with the promise of change. This was a world in movement, a land that carried its own story, and they were part of it. They moved with awareness that this crossing was unlike any before. It was not simply a journey of survival, but a passage into something deeper. Every step was a crossing of thresholds, of geography, of time, of identity. The fracture had become a transformation. Movement was no longer merely about reaching another place. It had become an act of becoming. The crossing shaped them. They moved with bodies strengthened by distance and minds sharpened by attention. Every day demanded endurance, every night brought reflection. Movement was both trial and transformation. The crossing was teaching them not only how to travel, but how to live within change. Migration was no longer a necessity alone, it had become a lesson in resilience. They moved as a living community. Migration was not an individual act but a collective one. The group moved as one body, bound by shared purpose and trust. Elders guided with memory and wisdom. Hunters scouted with skill and instinct. Children followed, learning the language of movement. The crossing was an act of collective endurance, a living story told in footsteps. The fracture beneath their feet had redrawn their understanding of home. Home was no longer a place fixed by stone or memory. Home was the movement itself, the carrying forward of life, of knowledge, of identity. They carried home in their steps, in the fires they kindled, in the stories they told beside those fires. Migration became the living embodiment of home as journey. The crossing demanded attention. Every step required reading the land, the shape of snowfields, the sound of shifting ice, the scent of melting water. They learned to move with awareness, guided not by maps but by living knowledge. Migration became a deep engagement with the world. Movement was a conversation with the land, a dialogue that was learned step by step. They moved with courage. The crossing carried danger, hidden crevasses, rivers swollen with meltwater, sudden storms. To move was to embrace uncertainty. It was to step into the unknown with both caution and hope. This courage was not loud but quiet, carried in the steadiness of steps, in the trust between members, in the shared purpose that bound them forward. The crossing was shaped by rhythm. Days were measured in distance and breath. Nights were measured in warmth, repair, and story. Movement was a cycle of motion and pause. These pauses were not gaps in the journey but part of its meaning. They were moments to rest, to reflect, to learn. Migration became not just an act of survival, but a living ritual of becoming. The land was both challenge and teacher. Meltwater channels tested their skill. Ice fields tested endurance. Storms tested resolve. Yet the land also offered sustenance. Valleys held game, rivers offered fresh water, sheltered spaces offered rest. Movement was a negotiation between risk and reward. Migration became a living balance, a negotiation written into every step. The crossing carried transformation. It reshaped bodies and minds, communities and identities. Every step changed the way they saw themselves and the world. Migration became a living process of adaptation, a passage not only through space, but through states of being. They were no longer simply travelers. They were part of the living story of movement. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses of stillness. These silences became part of the language of movement. In stillness they listened, to the sound of wind over ice, to the murmur of running water, to the voices of the group. Silence became a teacher, a space in which the crossing itself became deeper. Migration was as much about listening as it was about moving. They moved with a sense of carrying something beyond themselves. Migration was a passage of life, memory, and tradition. They carried knowledge of past journeys, of survival, of the language of the land. This carrying was not static. It was shaped by the crossing itself. Memory became movement, and movement became memory. Migration was a living bridge between past and future. The crossing demanded endurance. It tested strength of body and spirit. It demanded trust, cooperation, and attention. Yet it also carried hope. Hope was not a distant dream but a constant companion, the quiet force that carried them forward. Migration became a living affirmation of life in the face of change. Every step was a proof that movement was survival, and survival was hope. The crossing was also a transformation of perspective. To move was to learn. To cross was to see the world anew. Every step was a lesson in the language of the land, in the art of endurance, in the meaning of life in movement. Migration became a kind of wisdom, a living knowledge written in the footprints of those who walked before. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer simply a rupture. It had become a threshold, a passage from one world into another. Movement was the crossing of that threshold. It was a conscious decision to carry life forward, to embrace change, to transform. Migration was not merely travel. It was an act of becoming. And so they moved forward. Step by step, crossing into the unknown. They carried memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was the essence of life. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end. It was a beginning. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, in firelight, and in the silence of movement. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. The crossing had changed them. They no longer moved as they once had. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer simply an obstacle. It had become part of their journey, a living threshold between who they were and who they were becoming. Every step forward was an act of transformation. Migration had become not just a movement across land, but a passage of being. The land around them seemed to change with every step. Where ice had once held dominion, now there were rivers carving slow, certain paths. Valleys opened beneath skies that shifted in light and shadow. The silence of ice was replaced by the quiet music of water, the whisper of wind over stone, the distant cry of birds returning to a thawing world. This was a land alive with its own story, a story that they were now part of. To move in this world was to become part of its memory. The fracture beneath them was not an isolated event, but part of the living history of the earth. Every ridge, every channel of meltwater, every hollow was a page in that story. To cross was to read the land with one's body and spirit. Migration was not just travel, it was a living act of understanding. They moved with a deep awareness that every step carried meaning. Movement was not simply about survival. It was an act of becoming, an act of carrying life forward. They carried with them not only provisions and tools, but memory, identity, and tradition. Home was not a fixed place. It was the act of carrying life itself into the unknown. Migration became a living embodiment of home as journey. The crossing reshaped relationships. To move through uncertain land required trust, cooperation, and shared purpose. The group moved as one body. Elders guided with the wisdom of memory. Hunters scouted with skill and instinct. Children followed, learning the language of movement. Migration became a living process of community making, a forging of identity through shared endurance. They moved with care. The fracture beneath their feet had taught caution. Crevasses hid beneath snowfields. Meltwater channels could sweep away the unwary. Storms could arrive without warning. Yet movement carried necessity. To stay was to risk being left behind. To move was to affirm life itself. The crossing was both danger and necessity, challenge and affirmation. The rhythm of their movement was shaped by both urgency and attention. Days were measured by distance and effort. Nights by warmth and reflection. Movement was a cycle, a balance between motion and pause. Campsites became places of renewal, where fires were kindled, tools repaired, and stories shared. These pauses were as important as the steps themselves. They were moments when migration became more than survival, they became moments of reflection. The land taught them this rhythm. There were stretches of open tundra where movement could be swift, and hours passed in steady steps. There were fractured fields of ice where every movement required care. There were narrow valleys carved by meltwater, where progress was slow and deliberate. Movement was a conversation with the land, a dialogue that demanded listening. The fracture beneath their feet had also changed the meaning of home. Home was not a place fixed by stone or memory. Home was movement itself, the carrying forward of life, knowledge, and identity. They carried home with them in every step, in every fire lit at night, in every story passed from one to another. Migration became the living embodiment of home as journey. This carrying was not simple. It carried the weight of memory and the promise of the future. They carried knowledge of the land and of survival. They carried traditions and stories. They carried the quiet hope that movement itself was enough to sustain life. Migration became an act of carrying life forward, a living bridge between past and future. The crossing demanded endurance of both body and spirit. Every day tested them. Every night offered the chance to renew strength. The crossing was a test not only of survival, but of resilience. To move was to claim life against the silence of the fractured world. It was to embrace the unknown with courage. Migration became both necessity and affirmation. They moved with a sense of carrying something larger than themselves. Migration was not only a passage of bodies, but a passage of life. They carried the living memory of those who had come before. They carried the possibility of those who would come after. Movement was not a solitary act. It was part of an endless cycle, a rhythm written in footprints across the earth. The crossing also transformed how they saw themselves. They began to understand movement as more than travel. Movement was a way of knowing. It was a way of reading the language of the land, of understanding survival, of shaping identity. Migration became a kind of living knowledge, a wisdom written in motion and memory. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer simply rupture. It had become a threshold. To cross was to pass into another way of being. Movement became both passage and transformation. Migration was not simply the act of going forward. It was a conscious choice to embrace change, to carry life into the unknown, to shape the future. And so they moved forward. Step by step, crossing into what lay beyond. They carried memory, courage, and the living truth that movement was the essence of life. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, firelight, and the silence between storms. In every step lay a quiet affirmation: to move was to live. The fracture beneath their feet had become more than a landscape. It had become a living memory, a threshold between what was left behind and what lay ahead. To cross was to engage in something deeper, a passage that carried not only bodies, but histories, identities, and the quiet truth that movement was survival. They moved as though carrying the weight of generations, their footsteps writing a living story across the land. Every step was an act of translation. They moved through a language of signs written in ice and stone. Crevasses became lessons in caution. Meltwater channels became markers of change. The shifting light of sky and snow became a guide. To move was to read, not with eyes alone, but with the whole body. Migration was a form of living knowledge, a dialogue with the world. The crossing shaped them. It reshaped bodies hardened by distance and minds sharpened by attention. Movement demanded endurance, but it also demanded openness. Every day was a lesson in adaptation. To move was to learn to meet change with balance. Migration became a way of being, a constant negotiation between necessity and possibility. They moved as a collective. Migration was not a solitary act, but a shared passage. Elders carried memory and wisdom. Hunters carried skill and instinct. Children carried the future. The group moved together, a living community bound by shared purpose. Movement became a way of creating identity, a forging of connection through shared endurance. The fracture beneath their feet had reshaped the meaning of home. Home was no longer a fixed place defined by shelter or memory. Home had become movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home in their steps, in the fires they lit, in the stories they told. Migration became the living embodiment of home as a journey. The land taught them rhythm. Movement was shaped by the changing hours of day and night, by the needs of body and the language of the world around them. Days were measured in distance, nights in firelight and reflection. The crossing became a cycle, a living dance. Between motion and pause. These pauses were as meaningful as the steps themselves, moments for rest, for renewal, for the deep awareness of being in passage. The crossing demanded trust. They moved through danger, hidden crevasses, rushing meltwater, sudden storms. To step forward was to surrender certainty. Yet in that surrender was a quiet courage, carried in each steady footfall. Migration became an act of faith, faith in each other, faith in life's capacity to carry forward despite fracture. They moved with attention to both land and self. To cross was to carry awareness. Every ridge, every channel of water, every hollow in the ice was part of a living map they carried within them. Migration was a conversation with the earth, a living engagement that required listening, feeling, and adapting. Movement became a form of deep knowing. The crossing transformed perspective. It shaped how they understood the world and themselves. Movement was no longer just travel. It became a way of knowing life. Every step became part of a greater story, a story written in footprints, in firelight, in the silence between storms. Migration became a living memory, and memory became movement. The fracture beneath their feet was not simply rupture. It was a doorway. To cross was to pass into another way of being. Movement became both passage and transformation. Migration was not merely the act of going forward. It was a conscious choice, a choice to carry life forward, to embrace change, to create meaning. They moved carrying something larger than themselves. Migration was a passage of life, memory, and possibility. They carried the voices of ancestors who had crossed before them. They carried the hope of those yet to come. Movement became a living bridge between past and future. The crossing was a test of endurance. It tested body, spirit, and will. But it was also a test of meaning. To move was not only survival, it was an affirmation that life endures through change. Migration became a living proof of resilience, a testament to the human capacity to adapt and transform. The land was both challenge and gift. It tested them and nourished them. Meltwater offered fresh life. Valleys offered shelter. Even the fracture beneath their feet carried the gift of change, the opening of new paths, the invitation to carry life forward. Migration became a living act of balance between risk and renewal. They moved with quiet purpose. Migration was not only a passage of bodies but a passage of being. They carried memory, courage, and the living truth that movement was the essence of survival. Every step became a conscious act of carrying life forward. The crossing was also a moment of stillness. Between steps there were pauses, moments when they listened to the land. The sound of shifting ice, the rush of water, the cry of distant birds became part of the language of the journey. Silence became a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as it was about moving. The fracture beneath their feet was a living reminder that movement is transformation. To cross was to transform. Movement was a form of knowledge, a way of carrying life forward. Migration became a living passage, a crossing not only of land, but of being. And so they moved. Step by step, carrying memory and courage into the unknown. They moved with the knowledge that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, in firelight, and in the silence between storms. In every step was the quiet affirmation, to move was to live. The land before them stretched like an unwritten story, shaped by forces older than memory itself. The fracture beneath their feet had become not just a mark in the earth, but a living testament to change. To move forward was to step into that story, to become part of a passage written in ice and stone, wind and water. Migration had transformed into something more than movement, it had become a living language. Every step was an act of dialogue. They moved with bodies that read the land, senses attuned to subtle signs, the echo of shifting ice, the way wind bent over ridges, the scent of distant water. Movement became an embodied knowledge, a way of knowing the world without words. Migration was a language written in footprints, a conversation with the living earth. They moved with the awareness that they carried more than themselves. Every step carried memory, the memory of ancestors who had crossed before, the memory of campsites and fires, of seasons survived, of knowledge passed down. Migration was a living archive. To move was to carry life forward, to add their own footsteps to a story older than memory. The crossing shaped them. It shaped the body through endurance, the mind through attention, and the spirit through shared purpose. To travel was to transform. The fracture beneath their feet was not merely a gap in the land, but a threshold in their lives. To cross it was to move into something new, not only in place but in being. Migration became a living passage of transformation. They moved as a community. Migration was not an individual act, but a collective one. Elders carried memory. Hunters carried skill. Children carried the promise of continuity. Together they moved as one body. This movement was a shared ritual, a living creation of identity. To cross was to be part of a living tradition, passed forward step by step. The fracture beneath their feet had reshaped their understanding of home. Home was no longer fixed in a single place. Home was the movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home with them, in their tools, in their fires, in their stories. Migration became the embodiment of home as journey, a living bridge between what was left behind and what lay ahead. They moved with care. The crossing demanded caution. Crevasses lay hidden beneath snowfields. Meltwater channels could sweep away the unwary. Storms could arrive without warning. Yet movement was necessary. To stay was to surrender. To move was to affirm life. Crossing was both challenge and choice, a conscious act of endurance and becoming. The rhythm of movement was shaped by both necessity and attention. Days were measured in distance and effort. Nights in firelight and reflection. Movement became a cycle, a living rhythm between action and stillness. These pauses were moments of renewal, where the body recovered and the mind reflected. Migration was not merely a sequence of steps, but a living meditation on the meaning of movement. The land shaped the crossing. Open tundra offered swift motion, fractured ice demanded caution, narrow valleys slowed their passage. Movement became a negotiation with the world. Every step was both a question and an answer, a way of engaging with the living earth. Migration became a dialogue, and the crossing became a shared conversation with the land itself. The fracture beneath their feet had changed the meaning of home. Home was not a fixed place, but a living act of carrying life forward. They carried home in memory, in tradition, in the living rhythm of movement. Migration became an expression of identity, a continuous passage that transformed those who moved and the world they moved through. They moved carrying something larger than themselves. Migration was a passage of life and memory. They carried the wisdom of those who had crossed before them, the knowledge of survival, the promise of those who would follow. Movement became a living bridge between past and future. To cross was to carry life forward. The crossing demanded endurance of body and spirit. It tested strength, skill, and the will to continue. But it also demanded trust. Trust in each other, trust in the rhythm of movement, trust in the capacity of life to adapt. Migration became a living proof of resilience, the affirmation that life endures through change. They moved with purpose. Migration was not simply travel. It was a conscious choice, to carry life forward, to embrace change, to transform. Every step was an act of creation, a living expression of endurance, memory, and hope. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer a rupture alone. It had become an opening, a passage into a new way of being. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses, moments when they listened to the land. The sound of cracking ice, the rush of water, the cry of distant birds became part of the language of the crossing. Silence was a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as it was about moving. They moved with awareness that they were part of something greater. Migration was not an isolated act. It was part of an ongoing cycle, a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in a story that stretched far beyond them. Every crossing was a continuation of that story, a renewal of life itself. Movement was memory, and memory was movement. The crossing transformed perspective. They began to understand movement as a form of knowing, a way of engaging with the world and with themselves. Every step was a living lesson, a way of reading the language of the land, of understanding endurance, of shaping identity. Migration became a kind of living wisdom. And so they moved. Step by step, carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a threshold. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footprints, in firelight, and in the silence of movement. In every step lay a quiet affirmation: to move was to live. The crossing had become something larger than a journey. It was no longer merely movement through land, but a passage through meaning itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not simply a rupture in ice and earth, but a threshold, a living symbol of change. Every step across it was a step into transformation. Migration had become a living testament to endurance, memory, and the quiet truth that life is movement. They moved as if carrying a story written in footprints. Every step was an act of continuation, a connection to those who had crossed before them. The memory of ancestors moved with them, carried in muscle and breath, in the quiet rhythm of footsteps over stone and ice. Migration was a living archive, each crossing a new chapter in the story of life. The fracture beneath their feet had changed more than the land. It had changed their sense of time. Movement was no longer counted only in hours or days, but in generations. They carried with them the memory of crossings past and the hope of those yet to come. To move was to participate in a cycle larger than themselves, a cycle that bound past, present, and future together. The land shaped their movement. There were stretches of open tundra where travel was swift and measured. There were fractured fields of ice where every step required caution. There were valleys carved by meltwater where progress slowed to careful deliberation. Movement became a negotiation with the living earth. Every step was both a question and an answer, a conversation between traveler and land. They moved as a living community. Migration was not a solitary act. It was collective. Elders carried memory and guidance. Hunters carried skill and foresight. Children carried the promise of what was to come. Together they became a single body, bound by shared endurance and purpose. Crossing was a living act of identity, a creation of community through movement. The fracture beneath their feet had changed the meaning of home. Home was no longer fixed. It was movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home in their bodies, in the fires they lit at night, in the stories spoken under the sky. Migration became the embodiment of home as a journey, a living passage of identity and memory. They moved with attention and care. To cross was to read the land with body and spirit. Every ridge, every channel of meltwater, every hollow was a sign to be understood. Movement became an act of listening. Migration was a conversation with the earth, a living dialogue written in footprints. The crossing demanded courage. Hidden crevasses, swift meltwater, sudden storms, all carried danger. Yet to move was to affirm life. Every step forward was an act of trust, in themselves, in one another, and in the capacity of life to endure. Migration became both necessity and choice, endurance and transformation. The rhythm of their movement was shaped by both urgency and reflection. Days were measured in distance and effort. Nights in firelight and quiet. Movement became a cycle, a living dance between motion and pause. These pauses were as meaningful as the steps themselves. They were moments of renewal, of remembering, of being aware of the living act of crossing. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses to listen, to the sound of shifting ice, to the murmur of meltwater, to the cry of distant birds. Silence became part of the language of movement. Migration was as much about listening as it was about stepping forward. They moved carrying something beyond themselves. Migration was not only passage of bodies, but passage of life, memory, and possibility. They carried the living knowledge of ancestors, the lessons of survival, and the hope of those who would follow. Movement became a living bridge between past and future, a continuation of life itself. The crossing tested endurance of body and spirit. It tested trust, attention, and the capacity to carry on despite uncertainty. But it also carried hope, not a promise of arrival, but a faith in the meaning of movement itself. Migration became an affirmation that life endures in passage. The fracture beneath their feet was not only an end. It was a beginning. Every step beyond it was an entry into a world renewed. To move was to pass through threshold and transformation. Migration was not merely a physical crossing, but a passage of being. They moved with a quiet purpose. Migration was a living act of creation. Every step was an offering, to memory, to life, to the future. Movement became a living affirmation that existence is defined by crossing, by passage, by the courage to move forward despite the unknown. And so they moved. Step by step, carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not a boundary, but a threshold into something greater. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footprints, firelight, and the silence of passage. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. The crossing had changed them forever. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer merely a scar in the earth, it had become a living threshold, a place where worlds met and transformed. To cross it was to step into a new state of being. Movement was no longer simply a necessity. It had become a profound act of becoming, an expression of life itself. They moved as if carrying something sacred. Each step was not just forward, but inward, a movement that carried memory, courage, and the quiet affirmation of existence. The fracture had taught them that to move is to remember and to create. Migration became an act of living history, each crossing a chapter in the story of life. The land they traversed was alive with its own language. Ice whispered in creaks and groans. Meltwater sang in channels carved through stone. Wind carried stories across ridges. To move was to listen to these voices, to understand the language of the earth without words. Migration became a conversation written in footsteps, a living dialogue between human and land. They moved with awareness that they carried more than their bodies. They carried memory. They carried the weight of generations who had crossed before. They carried knowledge of survival and the promise of life beyond the fracture. Movement was not only passage but inheritance. Migration became the living act of carrying life forward, a bridge between past and future. The crossing shaped them deeply. Movement transformed body and mind. It demanded endurance, attention, and trust. It shaped relationships, weaving individuals into a living community. Elders became guides, hunters became scouts, children became witnesses to the passage. Migration became a shared creation of identity, forged in movement and memory. The fracture beneath their feet redefined home. Home was no longer fixed. It became the movement itself, the act of carrying life forward. They carried home in their tools, their fires, their stories. Migration became the embodiment of home as journey, a living passage of belonging and becoming. They moved with care. The crossing demanded caution and attentiveness. Hidden crevasses, sudden storms, rushing meltwater were constant reminders that movement was not simple. Yet to stand still was to surrender life. To move was to affirm existence. Every step became both an act of necessity and a conscious choice, the choice to carry life forward. The rhythm of movement became a form of living knowledge. Days were measured by distance, nights by reflection. Movement became a cycle of action and stillness. These pauses were not gaps in the journey but part of its meaning. They were moments for renewal, moments to listen, to reflect, to engage deeply with the living world. Migration became a living meditation. The land shaped their crossing. There were stretches of open tundra where movement was swift. There were fractured fields of ice demanding careful steps. There were valleys carved by meltwater that slowed progress to deliberate motion. Movement became a negotiation with the living earth, a balance between risk and reward. Every step was both question and answer, a conversation with the world. The fracture beneath their feet taught them to carry something larger than themselves. Migration was passage of life and memory. They carried knowledge, tradition, and hope. They carried the quiet truth that life endures in movement. Migration became a living bridge between what was left behind and what lay ahead. The crossing tested endurance of body and spirit. It demanded trust in each other, trust in life, trust in the rhythm of movement. To step forward was to choose uncertainty with courage. Migration became a living proof of resilience, an affirmation that life endures despite fracture. They moved with purpose. Migration was not mere travel. It was a conscious act, an offering to memory, to life, to the future. Every step was a creation, an expression of endurance and hope. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a threshold into another way of being. Movement was transformation. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses of listening. The sound of shifting ice, the rush of meltwater, the cry of distant birds became part of the language of the crossing. Silence became a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as moving. They moved with the awareness of being part of something greater. Migration was not a solitary act. It was part of an ongoing cycle, a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story. Every crossing renewed that story. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing transformed perspective. Movement became a way of knowing. Every step was a living lesson, a passage of understanding the language of the land, the art of endurance, the meaning of life in motion. Migration became a living wisdom written in footprints. And so they moved. Step by step, carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end but a beginning. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, firelight, and silence. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. The fracture beneath their feet had become more than a physical divide. It was a living threshold, a moment in time that carried the weight of transformation. To cross it was to enter a new state of being. Movement was no longer merely survival. It was an act of creation, a living passage that bound past, present, and future together. They moved with the awareness that they were carrying not only themselves, but generations. Every step was an inheritance and an offering. They carried memory, of those who had crossed before, of stories told beside ancient fires, of survival learned through centuries. Migration was the living embodiment of that memory. Every crossing was a renewal of life's ongoing story. The land spoke in silence and sound. Ice groaned beneath their feet. Meltwater sang in channels carved deep through stone. Wind carried voices across ridges. Every sign was a part of the living language of crossing. To move was to listen, to read the land with the body and spirit. Migration became a conversation without words, a dialogue written in footprints. The crossing shaped them. Movement transformed body, mind, and spirit. It demanded endurance, attention, and trust. It reshaped relationships, forging individuals into a living community. Elders became guides, hunters became scouts, children became witnesses. Migration became a collective act of identity, a living creation carried forward in movement. The fracture beneath their feet redefined the meaning of home. Home was no longer fixed. It became movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home in their bodies, in their tools, in the fires they kindled, and in the stories they told. Migration became a living passage of belonging and becoming. They moved with care. Crossing demanded caution. Crevasses lay hidden beneath snowfields. Meltwater could sweep away the unwary. Storms could arrive without warning. Yet movement was necessity and choice. To stand still was to surrender life. To move was to affirm existence. Crossing became both challenge and affirmation. The rhythm of movement became a living knowledge. Days were measured in distance, nights in reflection. Movement became a cycle of action and pause. These pauses were not gaps but moments of renewal, where the body recovered and the mind reflected. Migration became a living meditation, a conversation between being and becoming. The land shaped their movement. Open tundra allowed swift travel. Fractured ice demanded careful steps. Valleys carved by meltwater slowed their pace. Movement became a negotiation with the living earth, a balance of risk and reward. Every step was a question and an answer, a conversation with the world itself. The fracture beneath their feet taught them to carry something larger than themselves. Migration was passage of life and memory. They carried knowledge, tradition, and hope. They carried the truth that life endures in movement. Migration became a living bridge between past and future, a crossing written in footsteps. The crossing tested endurance of body and spirit. It demanded trust, in each other, in life, in the meaning of passage. To step forward was to embrace uncertainty. Migration became living proof of resilience, the affirmation that life continues despite fracture. They moved with quiet purpose. Migration was not mere travel. It was a conscious act of creation. Every step was an offering to memory, life, and the future. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end but a threshold into something greater. Movement became transformation. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses to listen. The shifting ice, the rush of meltwater, the cry of birds became part of the language of the crossing. Silence became a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as moving. They moved with the knowledge that they were part of something greater. Migration was not an isolated act. It was part of an ongoing cycle, a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story. Every crossing renewed that story. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing transformed perspective. Movement became a way of knowing. Every step was a living lesson, a way of understanding endurance, identity, and the language of the land. Migration became a living wisdom, written in footprints across time. They moved carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. Every step beyond it was a passage into renewal. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footprints, firelight, and silence. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. And in this crossing, they became more than travelers. They became witnesses to the living passage of life itself. The crossing was no longer just a journey. It had become an embodiment of life itself, a living passage between what was left behind and what lay ahead. The fracture beneath their feet had ceased to be merely a rupture in the earth. It had become a symbol, a living threshold marking transformation. Every step forward was not just movement, but an act of becoming. They moved carrying something beyond survival. Every step was an offering to memory, to the generations who had crossed before, to those who would follow. Migration was a living archive, each crossing a renewal of life story. The fracture beneath their feet was a moment of passage, a chapter written in footsteps. Crossing was an act of memory, a way of carrying life forward. The land spoke in silence and sound. Ice groaned beneath their weight. Meltwater sang in channels carved deep through stone. Wind carried stories across ridges. These were not just sounds, but a language of crossing, of endurance, of becoming. To move was to listen, to read the land with body and spirit. Migration became a conversation without words. They moved with awareness that they carried not only themselves, but the living memory of those who had crossed before. They carried knowledge of survival, of tradition, of endurance. Movement became an inheritance, a bridge between past and future. Migration was the living act of carrying life forward. Every step became a continuation of that eternal passage. The crossing shaped them. Movement was transformation. It shaped body, mind, and spirit. It demanded endurance and attention. It reshaped relationships, forging individuals into a living community. Elders became guides, hunters became scouts, children became witnesses. Migration became a shared creation of identity, written in movement and memory. The fracture beneath their feet had redefined home. Home was no longer a fixed place. Home had become movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home in their tools, in their fires, in the stories told beside those fires. Migration became the embodiment of home as journey, a living passage of belonging and becoming. They moved with care and attention. Crossing demanded caution. Crevasses lay hidden beneath snowfields. Meltwater could sweep away the unwary. Storms could arrive without warning. Yet movement was necessity and choice. To stand still was to surrender life. To move was to affirm existence. Crossing was both challenge and offering. The rhythm of movement became a form of living knowledge. Days were measured by distance and effort. Nights by reflection and firelight. Movement became a cycle of action and stillness. These pauses were moments of renewal, where the body recovered and the spirit reflected. Migration became a living meditation, a deep listening to the rhythm of passage. The land shaped their crossing. Open tundra allowed swift movement. Fractured ice demanded caution. Valleys carved by meltwater slowed their pace. Movement became a negotiation with the living earth, a balance of risk and reward. Every step was both question and answer, a conversation between traveler and land. The fracture beneath their feet taught them to carry something larger than themselves. Migration was passage of life and memory. They carried knowledge, tradition, hope. They carried the truth that life endures in movement. Migration became a living bridge between past and future, a crossing written in footprints. The crossing tested endurance of body and spirit. It demanded trust in each other, in life, in the passage itself. To step forward was to embrace uncertainty with courage. Migration became proof of resilience, an affirmation that life continues despite fracture. They moved with quiet purpose. Migration was not mere travel. It was a conscious act of creation. Every step was an offering, to memory, to life, to the future. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end but a threshold into something greater. Movement became transformation. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses. To listen. The shifting ice, the rush of meltwater, the cry of distant birds became part of the language of the crossing. Silence became a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as it was about stepping forward. They moved with awareness of being part of something greater. Migration was not an isolated act. It was part of an ongoing cycle, a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story. Every crossing renewed that story. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing transformed perspective. Movement became a way of knowing. Every step was a living lesson, a way of understanding endurance, identity, and the language of the land. Migration became living wisdom written in footprints across time. They moved carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. Every step beyond it was a passage into renewal. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, firelight, and silence. In every step lay an affirmation: to move was to live. And in crossing, they became more than travelers. They became part of the eternal passage, witnesses to the living rhythm of life. Movement was their memory, their creation, their future. The fracture beneath their feet was not a wound, but an opening, an invitation to continue, to carry life forward, to be part of a story without end. The crossing was no longer simply an act of movement. It had become an unfolding story, a living testament to endurance, memory, and transformation. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer just a mark upon the earth. It had become a threshold, a place where past and future converged. Every step beyond it was both an ending and a beginning. Migration was not merely travel, it was passage into meaning itself. They moved carrying more than bodies. They carried memory, the living archive of those who had crossed before, the knowledge passed down through generations, the quiet wisdom that life is movement. Migration became a conversation with the earth itself. Every step was both question and answer, a dialogue written in footprints. The land spoke in silence and sound. Ice groaned underfoot. Meltwater sang in channels cut deep through stone. Wind carried stories over ridges. These were not just sounds but a language of crossing, endurance, and becoming. To move was to listen, to read this language with body and spirit. Migration became a living poem written in motion. The fracture beneath their feet had reshaped them. Movement transformed body, mind, and spirit. It demanded endurance, attention, and trust. It shaped relationships, turning individuals into a living community. Elders became guides, hunters became scouts, children became witnesses. Migration became a shared act of creation, an identity forged in passage. The fracture beneath their feet had redefined home. Home was no longer a fixed place. Home had become movement itself, the carrying forward of life. They carried home in their tools, their fires, their stories. Migration became the embodiment of home as journey, a living passage of belonging and becoming. They moved with care. Crossing demanded caution. Crevasses lay hidden beneath snowfields. Meltwater could sweep away the unwary. Storms could arrive without warning. Yet to stand still was to surrender life. To move was to affirm it. Every step became both necessity and choice, an offering to life itself. The rhythm of movement became a form of living knowledge. Days were measured in distance, nights in reflection and firelight. Movement became a cycle, action and stillness, motion and pause. These pauses were moments of renewal, where the body recovered and the spirit reflected. Migration became a living meditation, a conversation between being and becoming. The land shaped their crossing. Open tundra allowed swift travel. Fractured ice demanded careful steps. Valleys carved by meltwater slowed pace. Movement became a negotiation with the living earth, a balance of risk and reward. Every step was both question and answer, a conversation between traveler and land. They moved carrying something larger than themselves. Migration was passage of life and memory. They carried knowledge, tradition, hope. They carried the quiet truth that life endures in movement. Migration became a living bridge between past and future, a crossing written in footprints. The crossing tested endurance of body and spirit. It demanded trust, in each other, in life, in the passage itself. To step forward was to embrace uncertainty with courage. Migration became living proof of resilience, an affirmation that life continues despite fracture. They moved with quiet purpose. Migration was not mere travel. It was a conscious act of creation. Every step was an offering, to memory, to life, to the future. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end but a threshold into something greater. Movement became transformation. The crossing was also a moment of silence. Between steps there were pauses to listen. The shifting ice, the rush of meltwater, the cry of birds became part of the language of crossing. Silence became a teacher. Migration was as much about listening as it was about moving. They moved with awareness of being part of something greater. Migration was not an isolated act. It was part of an ongoing cycle, a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story. Every crossing renewed that story. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing transformed perspective. Movement became a way of knowing. Every step was a living lesson, a way of understanding endurance, identity, and the language of the land. Migration became living wisdom written in footprints across time. They moved carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end, but a beginning. Every step beyond it was a passage into renewal. In crossing, they became part of the living story of the earth, a story written in footsteps, firelight, and silence. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. And in this final crossing, they became more than travelers. They became witnesses to life's living passage. Movement was memory. Memory was movement. The fracture beneath their feet was not a wound, but an opening, an invitation to continue, to carry life forward, to become part of a story without end. Their journey was complete, yet it was also eternal. For migration is not a destination. It is the living act of life itself, an endless crossing, written step by step in the language of the earth. The crossing had reached its end, but the story was far from complete. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer a rupture alone, it had become a living symbol of transformation. To cross was to step into a new state of being. Migration was no longer merely survival, it was the living act of carrying life forward. Each step had been a chapter, every pause a reflection. Together, they became a living story written in footprints across time. The land they crossed had shaped them in ways they could only begin to understand. Ice, stone, and water spoke to them without words. The fracture beneath their feet became a teacher, revealing the truth that movement was not simply crossing space, but crossing into new ways of knowing. To move was to engage in a conversation with the living earth, a dialogue carried forward in each step. Migration had become language itself, a language without words, written in motion. They carried memory as if it were a living fire. The footsteps behind them carried generations. They carried knowledge of survival learned in silence and hardship. They carried the stories of those who had crossed before, and they carried the hope of those who would cross after them. Migration was not the end of a journey but the continuation of life's story. Every crossing renewed that living thread. The fracture beneath their feet had transformed their sense of home. Home was no longer a fixed place. Home had become movement itself, the living act of carrying life forward. They carried home in their bodies, in the fires they kindled, in the stories told beside them. Migration became the embodiment of home as journey, a living passage of belonging. They moved with quiet purpose, not in haste but with deep attention. Every step was an offering, to memory, to life, to what lay ahead. To stand still would have been to deny the meaning of their journey. To move was to affirm it. The fracture beneath their feet became not a boundary but a bridge. Crossing was both an ending and a beginning, a passage into something greater. The rhythm of their movement became a form of living wisdom. Days were measured in distance, nights in reflection. Movement became a cycle, action and stillness, motion and pause. In the stillness, they listened to the world. The silence between steps became a place of learning. Migration was as much about listening as about moving, about becoming aware of the living passage they inhabited. They moved as a living community, bound by shared purpose. Elders guided with memory. Hunters watched with care. Children learned through witnessing. Migration was not a solitary act. It was a living creation of identity, written step by step in the crossing itself. The fracture beneath their feet had shaped them into more than travelers, they had become a living passage of life. The land shaped their movement, offering lessons in endurance. Open tundra gave swift passage. Fractured ice demanded attention. Valleys carved by meltwater required deliberate steps. Every choice of path became part of the story of crossing. Movement became negotiation, adaptation, and dialogue with the living earth. The fracture beneath their feet taught them something deeper. Migration was passage not only of body but of life and memory. They carried knowledge, tradition, and hope forward. Migration was a living bridge between past and future. Every crossing was an act of renewal, a continuation of the living story. The crossing tested them, body, mind, and spirit. It demanded trust. Trust in one another. Trust in life. Trust in the passage itself. To step forward was to embrace uncertainty. Migration became living proof of resilience, the affirmation that life continues despite fracture. They moved with awareness that every step was both an ending and a beginning. Migration was an act of creation, a living affirmation of life. The fracture beneath their feet was not a wound but an opening, an invitation to continue, to carry life forward, to write the next chapter in the story of the earth. The crossing became a moment of silence. Between steps they listened. To the groan of shifting ice, the rush of meltwater, the distant cry of birds. Silence became their teacher. Migration was as much about listening as about moving. In that silence, they learned something beyond words, that every crossing is also an inner passage, a movement of being. They moved with the awareness that they were part of something eternal. Migration was not an isolated act. It was part of a living rhythm of life. The fracture beneath their feet was one moment in an endless story. Every crossing renewed it. Movement became memory, and memory became movement. The crossing transformed their perspective. Movement became a way of knowing, a living lesson written in footprints. It was a language that spoke of endurance, of identity, of belonging. Migration became living wisdom. And so they moved. Step by step, carrying memory, courage, and the quiet truth that movement was life itself. The fracture beneath their feet was not an end but a threshold. In crossing, they became part of a living story, a story written in footsteps, firelight, silence, and memory. In every step lay the affirmation, to move was to live. And this final crossing became more than passage. It became an ending that was also a beginning, the living truth that life itself is an endless crossing. The fracture beneath their feet was no longer a rupture. It was a door. A passage into life's eternal movement. Migration was not a destination. It was life. They had crossed not only the fracture in the land but the fracture in meaning itself. They had entered a new way of being. And in that crossing, they became part of a truth older than memory, that to move is to live, and to live is to carry life forward.